tricky part with this is just me navigating the Zoom technology. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start letting people in. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm gonna give it just about a minute here, and then we will start jumping into things. All right. Well, I want to be sensitive to time, so let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Charles All, Vice President of Policy with the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and we appreciate you all taking some time on a very rainy day here, at least in Frankfurt. So hopefully then you can enjoy this webinar and just stay nice and dry here for a little bit. But we do appreciate you guys taking some time out of your afternoon. Our topic today here is wide-ranging. We're going to be discussing issues related to tariffs. We're going to discuss some of the tax legislation coming out of Washington, D.C., and then also sort of a generalized conversation on the state of the U.S. economy. And we have a phenomenal guest here with us to discuss all of these matters, Erica York. Erica is Vice President of Federal Tax Policy for the Tax Foundation. A lot of you all that are joining this webinar are probably very familiar with the Tax Foundation because of several of the projects that we have done in partnership with the Tax Foundation on state tax policy. But today our conversation is going to focus on the federal side of things. But if you want to see some of the work we've done in partnership with the Tax Foundation, we'll share some of those resources towards the end of the webinar, but you can always go to kychamber.com/research and see some of the research products that we've partnered on with our good friends over at the Tax Foundation. With that, I want to go ahead and kind of just jump straight into this conversation. I've been really excited to do this. Erica, thanks for taking some time to do it. We know you're very busy. You've done a lot of TV appearances lately to talk about tax, to talk about tariffs. And so before we jump into the meat of the conversation, if you could just take a couple of minutes, tell us a little bit about your background, your work at the Tax Foundation, and some of the work that you do there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me here today. So I have a master's degree in economic analysis, and that's from Wichita State University in Kansas. And then my undergrad is in business and economics from a small college in Kansas. I am a native Kansan, and I'm very fortunate to work remotely for Tax Foundation from Kansas. So even though I'm on our federal policy team, which is based in DC, I'm very fortunate to get to live in Kansas, though I did spend some time in DC when I first started at Tax Foundation back in November 2017. So Charles and I were talking earlier, and I said I'm coming up on my 7-year anniversary. I'm actually coming up on my 8-year anniversary there with Tax Foundation, and started as an analyst on the federal team in the middle of the debate then about the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax law. So one of my first experiences was coming one of my first days at work at Tax Foundation. My supervisor had printed off the bill, the House version of the bill, and she just slammed it down on my desk and said, "Okay, read this." So I started in federal tax policy, drinking from a fire hose, and it seems like we're back to drinking from the fire hose this year. I'm very fortunate now to get to lead the federal team, and so we are the largest team at Tax Foundation. Tax Foundation also has a global team, a state team, which y'all are very familiar with, and then a really great marketing team and development team as well. And we recently opened a sister office in Brussels, Tax Foundation Europe, to start looking at tax policy in the European Union. So busy on all fronts, but this year our team is really focused on what's happening with reconciliation as well as what's happening on the tariff front. So excited to get to dive into that here today.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And so let's jump straight in, and we're going to walk through a lot of the research that Tax Foundation's been producing kind of as a way of talking through these issues. And so the first question I have for you is maybe the most difficult one that I think we have today, which is to try to get an understanding of what the lay of the land is with tariffs and U.S. international trade policy. And so on your all's website, on one of the articles you've written on the tariff situation, you've actually published this huge timeline of activity. And I think very smartly that timeline goes, I think, all the way back to about 2016, which in reality, that's kind of where this whole conversation started. We've felt it more since April 2nd, which of course was Liberation Day. But really, this has been an ongoing conversation for going on 10 years or more now. As concisely as you can, could you try to just give us a sense of what the current landscape is, sort of what's in effect, what's not in effect, what's delayed, what's not delayed? Just help us just kind of paint that picture of what tariffs look like right now.
Yeah, we've got two main buckets of tariffs right now. I'll start with the simpler bucket. These are the sectoral specific tariffs. So these are done under Section 232 of the US trade law. And that's been used before by other presidents, by President Trump in his first term, to impose tariffs on specific types of products. So those are in place, in force right now on steel, aluminum, derivative products, so things that contain steel and aluminum but aren't like raw inputs. Those are in place as well on autos and auto parts. And then there are other pending Section 232 investigations on other sectors, including pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, trucks, lumber, and we could potentially see more of those investigations be announced in, around the July 9 timeframe for the decisions on the other bucket of tariffs. I'll say the Section 232 tariffs that are in place, those are not under threat by the court cases that are going on right now. These are completely separate from the legal challenges that the other tariffs face. The other tariffs were imposed starting in February through, April, under the an emergency economic powers law that had never been used to impose tariffs before. And so that's why the legal foundation there is a bit shaky. The word tariff is not even in the statute. And the first round of so-called emergency tariffs were on Canada, Mexico, and China, imposed in relation to fentanyl and the border crisis. Those have been struck down through court ruling, but they are currently still in place because of an appeal. Um, because those tariffs didn't really have anything to do strictly with fentanyl or border, they were applied very broadly to from China all imports, from Canada and Mexico to all non-trade agreement imports. So very broad, not related to the emergency at hand. The other bucket of emergency tariffs were the April 2nd, Liberation Day tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs. These apply to nearly every single trading partner, currently at a baseline rate of 10%. The the administration used a formula that basically boiled down to what is the bilateral trade balance between your country and the United States, and that's how we're going to set the tariff rate. Those were going to come into place on April 9th. They kind of did for a few hours, and then they got like a 90-day pause while the administration is supposed to be negotiating deals to avert those increases. Otherwise, those are scheduled to come back online in roughly a month. So that's kind of the lay of the land of tariffs. The way that I try to make sense of it, because we've heard a lot of different rationales for the tariffs, often rationales that are in tension with one another. The way I view it, the sectoral tariffs are kind of their own thing. They're there to stay. Those are either political constituencies or specific industries that the administration wants to provide import protection for. Then we've also got this idea of we want to generate some tax revenues through tariffs. And that's kind of what my view of the 10% baseline tariff is. This is a tariff that's just there to generate tariff payments that the administration can use for other things. And then the threatened increases, that's what's a little bit uncertain. There's the idea that these are for negotiation and we're going to try to get better trade deals. There's tension there, though, because the administration doesn't have trade promotion authority. There's no legal mechanism for them to do like trade agreements in the way that we would typically think of trade agreements. These are mostly just kind of deals on like paper that's not legally binding. And so that's also in tension with the idea that the administration really doesn't like bilateral trade deficits. And so will they just continue to impose those tariffs or not? So that's kind of how I think of the rationales for the tariffs. And then, of course, all of that could go out the window if IEPA, if the courts uphold that initial decision and say, no, IEPA doesn't provide for imposing tariffs, or at least not these specific tariffs.
Great. And then I should have asked you this at the very start, but could you offer just sort of in your mind a quick working definition of when you use the term tariff, what do you mean?
Yeah, so some people get tripped up because the word tariff doesn't actually have the word tax in it. That's just like an artifact of like history. Tariff refers to like the schedule you had to go look at to look up what tax was due on the specific type of import you were bringing in. So a tariff is a type of import tax. I'm sure most of the folks here on this call know that it's the importer bringing the good into the United States that pays the import tax to the US government. So this is not a tax that we're charging to like foreign governments or foreign businesses. Legally, it's a tax on domestic consumption here in the US. Of course, the burden of it can be borne by different people in the US. It doesn't necessarily stay with the importer. It creates a lot of difficult decisions for all the people involved. Importers have to decide, okay, am I going to raise prices for my consumers? Do I have to cut back on hiring? But ultimately, it's a tax that burdens the US economy.
Great. Okay. I want to talk now about impact. And I think these two charts I think are really fascinating, particularly the one on the left that kind of paints the historical context for these tariffs. And I have found this particular chart to be one of the most useful ways to sort of help people understand, regardless of your opinions on the issue, to understand the broader significance of what has happened over the past several months. And so these come directly again from the Tax Foundation. Could you just walk us through these two charts and kind of explain what they're communicating and some of the significance behind them?
Yeah, so the first chart goes back through history. We actually have the data set all the way back to like the early 1800s, but cut it off here just to make it easier to look at. But what you're seeing is the average tariff rate on all imports. So this is a calculation that takes customs duties that are paid into Treasury as a share of total goods imports. And so you'll see it used to be significantly higher. You see the spike from the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Act, and then you see it slowly come down in the decades after as Congress really put some, well, the Congress put some limitations on tariffs by delegating the authority to the president. So historically, tariffs were something that were set like line by line, that tariff schedule I mentioned, line by line set by Congress. That opened the process up to a lot of political wheeling and dealing. Each congressman or congresswoman wanted tariffs set for their own district, and it resulted in this mess of very high tariffs. And they delegated that authority to the president, delegated trade agreement authority to the president with the thinking that the president is going to have the national interest in mind rather than parochial interest, rather than just trying to represent the one industry in one district. Think of what's good for the economy overall. And that's why we saw the tariff rate climb down. You'll see a small spike in 2018 and 2019 from the then trade war. It's right around the 2020 line there in the bar or the line chart. And then you'll see this major spike. And this is the blue line spike is what would happen if all of the tariffs imposed so far this year remain in place for 2025. So it takes us back to an average tariff rate we haven't seen since the 1940s in the aftermath of Smoot-Hawley. You'll notice it's a little bit hard to see, but the green line is how high the tariff rate would spike if these emergency tariffs are ruled illegal and can't actually go into effect. And so they would have to be rebated. So customs duties revenues, tariff revenues would not be as high if you take out all of those emergency tariffs. But even with the sectoral tariffs that have been imposed so far, we're looking at a rate that hasn't been seen since about the 1970s. So either way, the court rules, we are looking at a significant, like a historically significant increase in tariffs, something that really hasn't been seen for generations.
Yeah,
And then,
and
yeah,
sorry, but one of the other things I noticed about this chart that is so interesting too is you don't see the sort of transition from levying a lot of tariffs down to, say the late 1980s, early 2000s. It's pretty gradual.
yeah.
And this sudden uptick is just, it's very severe. I guess the closest thing to that would have been maybe the early 1920s, is like when you just see that sort of sudden shift.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. This is very dramatic in that this would be occurring all in 1 year. Um, One of the things that even sets this apart further from past increases in tariffs is that trade now is so much more interconnected than it was in the early 1900s. Like if you think of global supply chains and how complex they are and how many times like a part or intermediate goods might cross borders before ultimately becoming a final product, trade is now just so much more complex than it was in the early 1900s or the late 1800s, which means a significant tariff hike like this is going to have much more drastic repercussions for the economy for certain types of businesses than it did even back then.
And then in this second chart here, this is where you all are trying to sort of contextualize the magnitude of the tax increase that we're talking about. So can you kind of walk us through these historical comparisons and help us understand that?
Yeah, so we've estimated that if all of the tariff threats are imposed and left in place, that would raise roughly $2 trillion of revenue over the next decade. We use the decade because that's the budget window that Congress uses for laws, so it just puts things kind of apples to apples. But what we try to illustrate here is that this would be a historically significant tax increase on its own. All of these other tax increases are laws that were passed through Congress and then signed into law by a president. This would be a tax increase done by a president acting unilaterally. And it's as large as, well, it depends what set of tariffs you're looking at. At one point in the year, it would have been larger than even the 1993 tax increase. But the interesting thing with tariffs, like other types of taxes, really, the higher you take the rates past a certain point, you actually lose revenue. And so several of the tariffs that have been threatened here, when you get into the rates of 50% or higher, or like the 145% tariff that was threatened on China, those actually lose revenue, which makes it not score as big of a tax increase, but still very, very large. But what you'll see here, I think, is especially interesting. We hear a lot about H.W. Bush and the pledge, like no new taxes, read my lips. This tariff, the tariff actions alone are larger as a share of the economy than that tax increase. That's so often, pointed at in history as a big mistake. Well, here we are again with a tax increase that's just a touch larger than that one.
So let's continue talking through the impact, because another thing that you guys have done is you've made some efforts to actually quantify what this means in terms of at least four different metrics. So you look at long run GDP, capital stock, pre-tax wages, and then I think probably most importantly to a lot of the folks that are watching this closely is just jobs, how this actually affects jobs. Could you just walk us through a little bit this table as much as you can and just sort of talk through sort of what this all means to sort of everyday people?
Yeah, and I think the thing that probably stands out most is the 0% on pre-tax wages. So I'll just start there and say When we approach modeling tariffs in our model right now, we model them as a consumption tax. Um, some aspects of tariffs are like a consumption tax. So if it's a tariff on a final consumer good, that's going to act very similarly economically to a sales tax on a final consumer good. So that's the approach that we take to modeling tariffs. And because of that, the labor supply adjustment that we model is a reduction in hours worked or a reduction in employment rather than a reduction in wages, because a consumption tax, if it's a true consumption tax, wouldn't affect productivity. Now, we know that this is not the most perfect way to model tariffs because, as I'm sure all the business owners on this call know, and probably others as well, we import more than just final consumer goods. In fact, about half of what we import would be capital goods or intermediate inputs, like steel that goes on to be put into a car or be put into a house. So when you place a tax on capital like that, it actually has a more negative effect on the economy than just a consumption tax. So for that reason, we think of our economic estimates here on the screen as kind of a lower bound of the harm to be expected because we're modeling this in the most generous way possible as a consumption tax. Tariffs in the real world are also going to have a negative impact on capital by increasing the cost of producing in the United States. So with that explanation, we estimate that just the sectoral specific tariffs, so looking at things that are not threatened by pending lawsuits, would shrink long run GDP by about 0.2%, shrink the capital stock, reduce employment by more than 150,000 jobs. The tariffs that are, pending this decision from the courts are much larger. They apply to all trading partners. They apply almost universally. They have some exceptions for like steel, aluminum, autos, but they're very close to a universal tariff. Those would shrink long run GDP by 0.6%, the capital stock by 0.5%, and employment by more than 500,000 jobs. And then we've also modeled the imposed and threatened retaliation from our trading partners. So you'll see the effects there. Altogether, this would be a reduction of almost 1% of long run GDP. And I think, if the tariffs actually went into effect, I think the retaliation would increase quite a bit. I think countries have been pretty measured in their responses right now, trying to game out, what's actually going to stick, what can we negotiate away. Once we see what actually sticks, I think we could see increases in retaliation.
So you mentioned a little bit ago some of the rationale that has been voiced for this. And so what we have up on the screen are several of the arguments that the White House has made in favor of imposing these tariffs. And they have a number of different views on these. And these come directly from the press release that was associated with the April 2nd tariffs. And again, it's a lot of different things here. Some of the arguments that we've seen is that other countries have been taking advantage of American companies. Um, Other countries have imposed their own trade barriers. The president has talked more about how we are exporting, or I'm sorry, importing more than we're exporting, and he wants to kind of reverse that. There's been some critiques of past free trade agreements and the sort of the whole era of free trade that it has led to the decline in manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and that tariffs can actually help reverse that trend. And then we've also heard arguments around national security, and other arguments saying that these tariffs actually won't have negative effects on job loss or higher prices, any of those types of things. And so we've put a bunch of those arguments up here on the screen. I was wondering if you could maybe take on a couple of these and just offer your thoughts, sort of offer some of your perspective on the validity of some of these arguments, how you might respond to them as an economist. Um, However you kind of want to approach it. I just kind of want to get your perspective on some of the arguments that we do hear in favor of these tariffs.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And I also have a piece in Reason magazine actually that goes through each of the studies from the White House's press release called Tariffs Work, explaining what the studies actually say. So I'll start there with the kind of tariffs work. They have boosted the economy, they have boosted US jobs. Um, what we know about tariffs is that they do create protection for certain industries, right? If we put a tariff on imported steel, that protects the domestic steel industry. That allows their profits to increase. When their profits increase, they can avoid layoffs, they can potentially hire more. And so from the 2018, 2019 steel tariffs, we did see that happen. US steel prices rose because domestic producers could raise their prices and still remain competitive given the 25% tax that was applied to imported steel. Most estimates show that that allowed domestic steel producers to hire about 1,000 extra workers. And then that's where most tariff proponents stop telling the story. But the story doesn't actually stop there because when domestic steel prices rise and when imported steel prices rise, that means everyone else has to pay more for steel. So that benefit for steel producers, or you can fill in the blank with anyone receiving production in any industry, is coming from someone else in the domestic economy. And so what some of the same studies that show, production increases and job increases in steel show is decreases in production and decreases in employment for downstream industries, particularly when we're talking about steel for manufacturers. So most studies suggest that at least 75,000 jobs in downstream manufacturing industries were lost for that 1,000 job gain in the steel industry. Most studies show overall production fell because while steel production increased, production of automobiles, farm equipment, production in the construction industry, all of that decreased due to higher input costs. And then when you layer retaliatory tariffs on top, US exports now face taxes in foreign jurisdictions, making it harder for their consumers to purchase those goods. Production and jobs fall even more. So it's really a story, for the most part, of looking at the net impact rather than just zooming in on the impact for the protected industry. This ties into what's going to happen to US manufacturing as well. Earlier, I mentioned about half of what we import are either capital goods or inputs. That means placing a tax on those actually increases the cost of production in the United States. So if one of your key inputs comes from a foreign country and now that key input faces a 10% tax, a 25% tax, a 30% tax, your cost of producing here in the United States just went up. And that's true whether you keep buying the imported good or whether you try to find a substitute, because that substitute you find is going to involve some type of opportunity cost. Maybe you have to pay a bit higher for it. Maybe it's not exactly what you need, so you have to change other things around. Maybe that supplier isn't as efficient, so you have longer wait times, whatever it may be. There's a cost involved with substituting away in the face of imports, too. As far as addressing trade imbalances, it's absolutely true that the United States imports significantly more than it exports, but it's absolutely wrong that a tariff will address that. What tariffs do is lower the overall level of trade. They don't actually alter the balance of trade. And that can seem really counterintuitive because when you first think of a tariff, you think, oh, we're placing a tax on imports. That means imports are going to fall, so our trade balance is going to be improved. Imports do fall, but exports fall as well. So there's this idea in economics called the Lerner symmetry theorem. It essentially says that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. And there's a few ways you can think of this. One is that interconnectedness I just mentioned. So when you tax imports, but those imports are inputs to the things that we export. Think of like the aerospace industry. Maybe you import some aluminum or you import other components and then you export a jet engine. If your cost of production goes up because of an import tax, you may be able to export less. The best way to view this really though is through what happens to currency values, and this gets into like international economics, which can feel a little bit complicated, but I think we can work through it. So if I reduce how much I'm importing, that means I'm exchanging, or a bank for me is exchanging fewer dollars in exchange for a foreign currency because I no longer need, euros to buy stuff from Europe because I'm not importing that anymore. When those exchanges fall like that, the value of the dollar goes up. So the dollar becomes stronger. And when the dollar becomes stronger, that means all of the customers for US exporters now have to exchange more of their home currency in order to get a dollar because the dollar has become stronger. So that means US exports fall because they become more expensive to foreign consumers. And so that's another kind of self-correcting mechanism you can see for how a tax on imports actually comes back and bites exporters. And so total trade falls rather than the trade balance changing. If we really wanted to do something to address the trade imbalance, we'd need to zoom out, not just look at trade and look at broader macroeconomic forces. The main driver of the trade deficit is actually the imbalance between how much Americans save and how much Americans invest. So we have, a given level of saving, our given level of investment is higher. There are a lot more investment opportunities that exist in the United States than exists domestic saving to fulfill those. And what fills in the gap is a capital inflow. Foreign investors come in and they finance additional investment in the United States. This investment is also, it's not just private sector, it's the government sector too. And the imbalance on the government side of the ledger is the federal budget deficit. We spend a lot more, the federal government spends a lot more than it brings in tax revenue, which creates a lot of dis-saving. Foreign capital flows in to fill that by purchasing US treasuries, right? So the way that you would reduce that capital inflow from the government's perspective would be to reduce the federal budget deficit. That's the most impactful tool that the federal government has. Other tools would be to, you know, create tax policies that encourage more private saving, so reduce the tax burden on saving so Americans save more. That helps close that gap. But trade policy is really just going to affect the level, not the balance of trade.
Interesting. All right, I want to move over, just keep with the economy. I want to remind folks though that are attending, if you have a question for Erica that you would like to submit, you can do that through the chat, and we will do our best to get to it. But we do want to talk through the broader economy, and then we'll get into the tax bill here in just a minute. But please do use the chat function if you have a specific question for Erica. So we've had about 4 months now since April 2nd, with Liberation Day. And what we've seen with the economy since then is not a ton in terms of hard data. There's a lot of soft data that is screaming different types of signals. So looking at things like consumer sentiment, small business optimism, CEO confidence, all of those things have shown pretty significant warning signs. But every month since then, including last Friday, we get the jobs report. Jobs report seems to show continued economic growth. On top of that, you look at something like unemployment insurance claims. We're not seeing a whole lot of layoffs yet. And so I want to get your take on what you think is going on with the economy. And first would be the first question I would have is, do you generally agree or disagree that we haven't seen much in the hard economic data to help us understand the impacts of this? That's my first question. Second question would be, as you monitor the economy for potential impacts from the tariffs, what are you going to watch most closely and what are you most interested in?
Yeah, I don't think we've seen a lot yet, and I don't think that's surprising. If you look at, I'd say one of the most important indicators right now that I'm watching, well, two would be economic policy uncertainty and trade policy uncertainty. So these are just broad indexes that measure, um, how are people feeling, what's going on in the news, what's going on in policy. Do we have a good sense of, what policy is going to look like 3 months out, 6 months out, or is it all up in the air? Right now, it's all up in the air. And so when something is all up in the air, I wouldn't expect, strong decisions to be made either way. A business isn't going to go on a hiring spree right now. They're probably not going to go on a firing spree unless they are so illiquid that, the tariff bill they're facing just makes everything impossible. So what I'd expect to see right now is things to kind of like freeze in place and a lot of hesitancy. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing in the data. Like the jobs report out last Friday. It wasn't gangbusters. It's not like we're really growing. There were downward revisions to past jobs reports. If you dive into like which sectors are actually expanding, it's not broad-based growth. It's pretty concentrated in a couple of sectors. And so to me, that tells me we're kind of just at this point of hesitancy. Like people don't know. We don't know what tariffs are going to stick. We don't know what tariffs are really going to be around. Are there going to be refunds for tariffs if they, get canceled? Nobody knows. And so I don't think we would expect to see like anything significant yet. I think that changes when either, well, if the tariffs are ruled illegal, then that probably saves us from, some big economic headwinds. If the tariffs are upheld and then we see what happens on July 9th when the 90-day expirations end, are there actually a lot of trade deals? The big tariff hikes aren't coming. Are the big tariff hikes coming? I'd expect once we have some certainty on actual policy, then we'll see businesses make, decisions in response to that. Um, and how it plays out also really depends a lot on what the Federal Reserve does.
Yeah.
So one scenario that could take place, we have a significant tariff hike. We know that it's like here to stay for at least, President Trump's term. Um, that places a big strain on employers because now they have this significant increase in costs. They have to decide, do we pass this on? Do we not? What we tend to see happen there is big disruption in the labor market, layoffs at industries that are particularly affected by higher costs. And of course, then when you have an increase in unemployment, the Federal Reserve has to or is prompted to step in and say, this violates our dual mandate. We don't want to see higher unemployment, so we need to loosen policy. Then we get a blip of inflation, run through the business cycle. So a lot depends on how the Fed reacts. Are they going to loosen policy if there's a large labor market disruption? Are they going to say, no, we don't want to do that. So we're left with this temporary period of higher unemployment until people find new jobs. It's tough to predict because it depends on that Fed response, which depends on how large and abrupt the tariffs are.
That's really interesting, and it leads me to a follow-up question to that I was thinking about. So let's say a year from now. So let's say first of all the tariffs go into effect, the April 2nd tariffs, they go into effect to some degree. And then a year from now, we're still looking at jobs reports that basically look like last Friday. So we're in that sort of 100K per month range. Unemployment is maybe somewhere in the mid fours. What do you think has transpired? Is that a situation where perhaps the Federal Reserve has intervened and they've lowered interest rates? Or could it be the effects of something like deregulation policies, maybe a stimulus-inducing tax bill? What types of things would have transpired? And I guess how likely of a scenario would that be in your mind to say have those tariffs go into effect and then we just kind of continue to see this sort of gradual job growth? Is that even a possible scenario in your mind?
It would depend really heavily on how real the deregulation is and, how real the tax package Congress passes is. Our modeling shows right now that like if the tax package as passed by the House is enacted, it would boost long run GDP by about 0.8%, which is what you get if you add up the two tariffs. So effectively, you kind of like have a wash as far as the macro effect. Now, that doesn't mean each individual taxpayer or each individual industry would see a wash. You'd have a lot of turbulence as far as like who is impacted and how, but the net effect would be close to washing out. Of course, our modeling doesn't take into account like uncertainty or those types of aspects. So I think you could still see, some consequences from the short-term uncertainty from just kind of the pause in economic activity that's happening right now. Um, yeah, it's tricky when so much is up in the air and you don't know. But like, let's say that the tariffs do go into effect. I don't want to be someone who predicts like, hey, we're going to have this huge, massive recession. Because really the answer is it depends. It depends on so many other factors. But what we do know is that tariffs will have a negative impact. They'll have a negative impact on investment, on people's incomes, on hiring across different sectors. And so I think it's safe to say that there will be a negative impact. We just don't know exactly how that impact will come to life. It'll depend on, how each business decides to respond. Are they increasing prices? Are they laying off employees? Are they doing a combination of both? As far as how it'll play out in the aggregates.
Right. Let's talk about that tax bill a little bit now. So why don't I think it might be most useful, Erica, if you just take a second to say, here's where we are in the process in terms of passing this very large piece of legislation, big, beautiful, as we're all calling it. And then sticking, I guess, mostly with just the tax provisions. What's the really high level stuff that you think employers, policymakers at the state level, what do they need to know about the most?
Yeah, so Congress is using the reconciliation process, which essentially allows them to fast track it in the Senate, fast track the bill in the Senate, but requires that the bill comply with certain procedural rules surrounding how much it can increase the deficit, surrounding what it can do in the long term. What we have right now is a House passed version of the bill that's now sitting in the Senate, and the Senate is working on its version. Um, you know, Leaders in the Senate and the House have outlined this July 4th deadline for when they want the bill to be passed. For them to meet that deadline, the Senate would have to release their version of the text a week from today. This coming Monday, we would have to have legislative text in the Senate. It would then go through kind of that rules process I was talking about. The Senate parliamentarian would go through. There would be challenges to say, hey, this violates the reconciliation rules, and lawmakers would argue about that, and the parliamentarian would advise on what to do. And then the Senate would have to pass the bill essentially 2 weeks from today. They would go through the vote-a-rama process. And then that would give the House a week to look at the Senate changes, decide whether they agree, through a conference committee process similar to what was done with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017 to reconcile the House passed version with the Senate passed version and get a final version of the bill to send to the president. So that's a very fast timeline. I don't know if they'll be able to make it or not, but we'll find out within a week if the Senate, gets text out. The big pieces of the House passed bill are first just a straight up extension of all of the expiring tax cuts. So that's individual rates and brackets, standard deduction, child tax credit, Section 199A pass through deduction, the estate tax exemption. Those are all extended, and then several of those have modifications made to them. The Section 199 pass-through deduction, for example, is boosted to 23% permanently. There's some reforms to the way that the phase-outs work on that to avoid big spikes in marginal tax rates that some folks experienced with the previous structure of the phase-in limitations. Other changes are temporary increases to the standard deduction for everyone, an additional bonus standard deduction for seniors, a larger child tax credit up to $2,500 above the current max is 2,000. This would take it to 2,500. No tax on tips, no tax on auto loan interest, no tax on overtime pay. The overtime pay provision is not for all overtime pay, it's for the zero point 0.5. So if you get time and a half, the half bonus time is what's tax free. Those additional tax cuts all last through 2028, so they would sunset after 2028. So while on the one hand you're getting some certainty with permanence for the expiring individual and estate tax provisions, on the other hand you're getting a slew of new tax cuts that would expire after 4 years. The big One of the biggest sticking points has been what to do with the $10,000 cap on the state and local tax deduction. The initial House bill would have increased that to $30,000. The final bill, in order to get the so-called SALT caucus on board, increased that cap to $40,000. That bonus cap phases down to $10,000 for very high income taxpayers. So it's those upper middle income taxpayers, instead of getting a $10,000 cap, they get a $40,000 SALT cap. So pretty big increase there. We've estimated that that boost to the SALT cap means it raises about $150 billion of less revenue over 10 years. So if you think of what could we do with $150 billion in the context of reconciliation, there would be a lot more pro-growth things you could do besides, boost the SALT cap for some folks. It also claws back most of the Inflation Reduction Act green energy tax credits. So the individual side credits like EVs, that sort of thing, it gets rid of those very quickly. There was a lot of debate about what to do for some of the others, like the production and investment tax credits, debate about when to start phasing those down. Should we wait until like later in the budget window to phase those down? Should we phase those down immediately? I think that's one of the things we'll see continue to be debated in the Senate because there's a lot more support for keeping some form of those green energy tax credits among senators than there is among the House, where the stronger voices are those who are concerned about the deficit and so want to claw those back as much as possible.
So we have some questions rolling in, Erica. And are you able to stick around for a few more minutes?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great. Could you just hit real briefly on your all's analysis of your projected impacts of the House version of the bill, and then we'll jump into some audience Q&A real quick.
Yes. So we estimate that the bill would boost output by about 0.8%. You'll see a pretty small effect here on the capital stock. And I should have mentioned this earlier in the overview. There are four key business provisions in this bill: 100% bonus depreciation, R&D expensing, a new bonus deduction for investment in certain types of structures, and returning to the EBITDA-based interest limitation rather than EBIT-based limitation. Those would be extremely pro-growth provisions if they were done on a permanent basis, but the House passed bill will sunset those changes after 5 years. So it only provides those key business provisions for 5 years, after which those taxes would go back up. And so the reason that we get a relatively small economic effect overall for the bill when it is about a $4.1 trillion tax cut is because those key provisions expire. So in the long run, if you're not improving incentives, you're not improving long run investment. The main effect we think you will see from the temporary business provisions is primarily a shift in timing. So businesses will pull forward investments that they were going to do anyway to take advantage of those provisions being in effect, rather than it being an expansion across the entire economy of investment. So the main drivers here that you're left with for the permanent effects are the reductions in individual income taxes. And while those do have an effect on growth, it's nowhere near the effect on growth that you get from incentivizing more investment, just because labor is not as responsive to taxation as capital investment. So you don't get as much bang for the buck for a tax cut for individuals, especially when a lot of the tax cuts are things like temporary no tax on tips or temporary increase in the additional standard deduction for seniors. Those aren't really powerful, economic incentives. Those are closer to, temporary tax carve-outs for certain constituencies. And so that's why we end up with a relatively minor economic effect. You'll see even on the dynamic side where we incorporate the economic effect into our revenue estimates. There's not a lot of feedback. This is still something that increases the deficit even on a dynamic basis.
And I will just add very quickly that you mentioned how there's a lot of the really pro-growth provisions of the bill are the investment-related provisions, ones that are encouraging investment, especially when it comes to cost recovery, depreciation. A lot of states try, or some states do, in fact, align their tax codes with those pro-growth provisions of the federal tax code. That's something we are working on in Kentucky. That's an area where we have a lot of opportunity for improvement. So we do encourage folks to be aware of that, but some obvious area for continued tax reform. Before we jump into questions, just for everyone, all the resources that we've talked about, they can all be found at these locations that I've listed right here. I would add to that kychamber.com/research, where you can see some of the reports we produced in partnership with Tax Foundation. So just a couple minutes here left to get into some interesting audience questions. One I thought is just a really straightforward, interesting question. I think in the context of the tariffs, as United States manufacturing firms look at this, or even as foreign manufacturing firms look at this new tariff regime, how likely are we to see a sudden resurgence of US manufacturing in response to tariffs? Should we anticipate new factories, new manufacturing plants? Walk us through sort of your mind on that question.
Yeah, so my thinking on that is even in a protected industry, I don't think you would be wanting to make a long-term investment decision based on current tariff policy. For one, we don't know if the bulk of the tariffs will even be able to remain in place, beyond this year, depending on how courts rule. And the second reason, even if courts do keep them in place, the on again, off again nature we've seen just from the administration in rolling out these tariffs and then pausing them and then putting some back into place and then canceling them and then adding exemptions, that's not conducive to making a long-term investment in the US economy. Now, once we get some certainty, I think, depending on what also happens on the regulatory front and the tax policy front, you could see some businesses expand. But I think it's very important to caveat that that is not a net expansion. That is pulling resources and activity away from one industry where it would be employed now to the protected industry. Similar to what we saw happen with the steel tariffs, right? Steel is protected. They can increase their profits. They can hire a little bit more, but those higher prices paid for steel are coming from someone else in the US economy, and that was downstream manufacturers. And I think, especially when you have really broad tariffs on everything, it just makes this argument about like we're doing this for the manufacturing sector extremely complicated because broad tariffs are increasing costs of production for many different lines of businesses. So I don't think that this is a policy mix that really boosts manufacturing. And I would also add, just kind of generally, if you look at why manufacturing employment has declined in the United States, it's followed the same pattern as it has followed in other developed economies. So what you see, in initial stages of economic development, most people are farmers and they transition from agriculture to manufacturing in early stages of development. And then at later stages of a development, when technology improves and when innovation improves and productivity improves, you can make the same amount of stuff with far fewer workers because your workers are so productive. So if you compare, say, the productivity of an American manufacturing worker to the productivity of a Chinese manufacturing worker, our workers are so much more productive. Multiple times more productivity associated with one manufacturing employee in the United States than in China. And so it makes sense that employment would decline and those workers would find employment in the service sector just because of productivity. And so even if you, for instance, bring back more manufacturing, it may not be a story of bringing back more jobs. It could be even more automation to do that production productively in the United States. So I think a lot of times when policymakers talk about manufacturing, they conflate all of these different trends, some of which are normal and expected and even good. Higher productivity is a very good thing. And so we don't want to do something that would jeopardize, productivity growth for the American economy.
So one more final question here to kind of round everything out. Do you see different effects from current tariff policy on small businesses versus large businesses?
I think the tariffs are more challenging for small businesses. Um, a few reasons for that. Small businesses typically don't have the same liquidity and, just options as large businesses. So a large business, seeing that the tariffs were scheduled, may have been able to rush orders and purchase a lot and store that in inventory ahead of when the tariffs would take place so they could ride out this temporary time of uncertainty. Small business may not have enough cash on hand or enough borrowing ability or enough inventory space to even do that in the short term. Longer term, larger purchasers have more ability to negotiate than smaller purchasers. There are also issues with lobbying. If we see an exemptions process open up, small businesses don't have the lobbyists who are connected in DC to be able to get an exemption. Large businesses do have those connections. So I definitely see a harsher impact to the small business community from tariffs than I do to large businesses.
All right. Well, we are going to end things there. Erica, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know you've been actively doing research, reporting, talking to people like us, talking to national news media about these issues. So thank you for taking the time, but also thank you for the great work that the Tax Foundation has been doing. Once again, folks, you can see some of the resources that we discussed up here on the page. And for folks that attended, we did record this webinar, so we will recirculate this with folks who attended. We'll also send out the slides as well as a brief summary, which we will post on our bottom line news website. So once again, thank you all for joining. We appreciate you taking the time, and I hope you found this informative. Thanks again, Erica.
Thank you so much.
Everyone have a good afternoon.